Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second installment of a series that is preparing us for a seminar that we'll be doing next month on Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. Actually, it begins next month. This is the Victory Center. This is the Victory Farm Center for the Humanities, and today we're being joined by Tyler. I can't talk right now, so actually I'm just going to turn it over as quick as possible so I don't keep butchering it. So. Tyler, if you just take a minute to introduce yourself and just kind of say a few words about the last presentation you gave us, and maybe how that ties into this one, that'd be great.
Sure. So thanks everyone for being here, showing up to this. I know that for most people, a Fichte talk is not like the most exciting thing in the world, but yeah, so the last talk was primarily centered around sort of an introduction, trying to get into the German Idealist tradition. And so we talked a lot about Kant, specifically the Kant of the Critique of Pure Reason. And then we talked about namely some kind of skeptical problems that some immediate post-Kantian skeptical philosophers pointed out with the Kantian system. And so what I kind of intend for us to do to sort of prepare you for working on the Phenomenology of Spirit and stuff like that today is to go over kind of two different things that go over two different topics that are related, but maybe difficult to point out how exactly they're related just at a glance. The first is we're going to talk about Fichte, and specifically Fichte talking about what it is to posit the NotI. And so, well, he says sort of infamously in his 1794 Wissenchaftslehre, which means something like science of knowledge or doctrine of scientific knowledge or something like that, that the I posits the NotI. And so we're going to go over some interpretive strategies over what that means, how you might interpret that kind of statement in hopes of giving sort of a general overview of the sort of contribution that Fichte provides to the German idealist tradition. And then that hopefully can lead us up to the second half, which is going to be some general tips, tricks, and strategies for reading the Phenomenology of Spirit. I should preface this with, all this stuff is my interpretation. I'm not an expert or anything like that. I'm a graduate student sort of working through this stuff on my own. So I'm just hoping that this would be useful to other people that are trying to read this kind of stuff. And so, yeah, that's sort of the goal for what we're going to be going over. So I guess just to get started. So what is Fichte's project? Like, why does anyone read Fichte? Like, what is Fichte doing? And I think that what would be most helpful is to go over, I think, the most common interpretation of what Fichte is up to that's present sort of in the history of philosophy. And this will involve interpreting that phrase that we talked about, the I posits the NotI. Okay, so in both sort of the analytic and continental traditions of philosophy, there's often an impetus to point to Fichte as where philosophy went wrong, when everything sort of went horribly wrong in the history of philosophy. And it can even be traced down to this one single sentence, which is the I posits the NotI. And so why is this such a catastrophe? Why is this such a train wreck for German philosophy in particular? You know, especially in a lot of analytic programs, the way that you'll learn about the history of philosophy is you'll read the modern tradition from Descartes to Kant, and then you just skip over the entire 19th century, and then you move on to like Russell, Frege, you know, that sort of logical positivist tradition. And the idea is everything goes so horrendously wrong at this moment that it takes about a century for us collectively to get over this kind of problem. And so what's so bad about it, right? we talked in the last meeting about Kant and the transcendental idealist tradition. And one of the central tenets of the transcendental idealist tradition is a commitment to the idea that in at least some sense, there is some thing in itself which you might think as something like material reality or some kind of reality that's outside of any relation to us. There's lots of different ways of interpreting that and going through that, but in general, Kant posits or something like that, the existence of a thing in itself. There's something that is not connected to human activity, something that we don't know about. Fichte gets rid of this, feature in the history of philosophy and says that instead of saying that there is a thing in itself, we should just call the thing in itself the NotI, and we should realize that the NotI is a posit or is a presupposition or something that we necessarily must think exists or that we just say exists or something like that. But in reality, it's not something that exists independently of us, but it's just something that we have to posit as collective I's, so as subjects or something like that. And so you can see why maybe everyone thinks that everything's gone wrong right here, right? It seems like what Fichte has done at this moment is just gotten rid of all material reality that's independent of human beings. And so you might think, yeah, things have gone really, really wrong right at this point. And so this is the kind of sense in which Fichte is viewed not only as a kind of idealist, so like maybe like a Berkeleyan idealist or something like that, but even worse, because at least Berkeley says that God exists or something like that, right? But now Fichte is at the point where everything that is outside of the I, outside of the subject, is only or just a posit of the I. And so if you were to read maybe like a very old school analytic rendition of what's happening in this tradition, then is that Fichte is getting rid of all the stuff that's outside of our head, putting it in our head, and then Schelling and Hegel are just going to follow suit, basically. Schelling's going to finally put nature as something which is really ideal or just mental, and then Hegel is going to take our social relations, history, all that kind of stuff that we normally think happens between human subjects and put them in the head of a single human subject. And so that's totally bizarre, or maybe not even a single human subject, but in the mind of God or something like that. In which case, that is totally bizarre. And why would we ever bother reading anybody in this tradition at all? That's something so crazy and so out of our purview, out of the sort of interests of our time, that it's not even really worth considering. And so that's sort of the standard reading of this phrase of saying that the I posits the non-I. That everything that we could say is independent of human-mindedness is actually really just something that we are imagining or something like that. So when you see the materiality of a table or something like that, it's only because I really wanted there to be a table and for it to be hard or something like that, which is absurd because we see stuff that we don't like all the time and it seems to exist and there's intersubjective agreement between people. And so this is just fundamentally untenable as an idea. And so this is kind of, I think, the most standard reading, especially in the early 20th century, of this specific passage and Fichte's philosophy in general. The last sort of remnants of some kind of realism in Kant, which was there with the thing in itself, Fichte just totally does away with. And this sort of leads into the German idealist tradition, which is completely opposed to any kind of materialism, any kind of naturalism, any kind of philosophy which can provide an adequate account of intersubjective relations or material things. And so why would it be of any interest to anyone except as a purely historical enterprise? Yeah.
It makes a lot of sense to me why a lot of people would find, idealism a problem or a dead end or a waste of time, but I don't see how it's a problem for a kind of even like a rigorous intersubjective theory. Like that, right? Like, is that a thing?
Well, so what I'm going to try to do is try to show like why this picture of what Fichte as well as the other German idealists are up to is totally wrong. But I think that if this view were correct, then it would be absolutely deadly to any theory of intersubjectivity. Why? Because there are other subjects, right? Other subjects that you would say exist are really just, all of you are not eyes to me or something like that. Right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, if this
Tyler, this is where, oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
This is where the, the solipsistic reading of him comes from, right? Is this kind of naive way of interpreting him?
Yeah, I think so. In this view, not only is Fichte the solipsist, he's maybe the only genuine solipsist in the entire history of philosophy. Like, at least Berkeley says that God exists and other minds exist. But on this interpretation, Fichte is just saying, only you as that I really exist, whereas everything else is a mere posit or something like that. Yeah.
You were saying that that's like a standard. This is standard. If I was to take most courses, this is probably what, that deal with German idealism. This is basically what they would say Fichte said.
This is, so I don't think it's really standard anymore, but I think like 20 years ago or something like that, this would have been standard. In the 20th century, this is sort of part of the standard history of philosophy. There's some people that are smarter than this and read Fichte in a better way. Like Lukács actually is an example of someone that actually reads Fichte really, really carefully. And there are other examples of people that sort of try harder or something like that. But no Fichte expert holds this view. No one that spent any significant amount of time with the text or working out any of the problems, no one holds this view. But for maybe if you were to ask someone that was just teaching a sort of standard history of modern philosophy course, this is the kind of answer they might give for what Fichte is up to. So it's kind of a pernicious myth, right? And the German idealist tradition is kind of full of these pernicious myths. I think almost more than any other philosophical period. I mean, maybe what is often referred to as postmodernism has like as many pernicious myths as the German idealist tradition has, but it's close. There's tons of myths and legends about the German idealist tradition because it's a lot easier to talk about the German idealists without having read them. And this is an example of this kind of view. You would normally just see someone sort of trot out this view if they're giving a long history of philosophy, didn't really want to bother with what Fichte or the German idealists were up to. They would cite like this passage and then say, see, he thinks everything's in your head. So, there we go. We can be done with it, And so obviously I want to say that this reading's totally wrong, that it gets things wrong at the most fundamental level, and that we can give actually a good charitable reading of what Fichte says when he says that the I posits the not I, without reducing everything to a kind of solipsistic, the phrase that's often used is subjective idealism. There's a lot more to Fichte than that, and it's a lot more interesting. And if you really want to understand Hegel, I think, then this stuff is actually really useful and important. We know that while Hegel was very critical of Fichte and the Fichtean project around the year 1800, which is when he published his first book called The Difference Between Fichte and Schelling's System of Philosophy, where Hegel is kind of one of the first people to trot out this kind of myth against Fichte. He actually begins to engage with Fichte a lot more seriously around 1803, 1804. And the Phenomenology of Spirit comes out in like 1806, 1807. And so there's good reason to think that actually that for Hegel, part of what led to his mature thought in the Phenomenology of Spirit was a really serious engagement with Fichte's thought. And just as the idea that Fichte thought that everything in your head is a pernicious myth, so too is the idea that what Hegel's up to is saying that everything's in your head, or that everything is in the head of like God or something like that. That's also a pernicious myth. It doesn't have anything to do with reality. There's no Hegel passage which justifies anything like this as an interpretation, or at least so I would argue. And so this is kind of the setup, right? This is what you might think at a first glance of just this passage. This is a common interpretation in the history of philosophy, but it's really wrong. And I think that if you look at the history of philosophy surrounding Fichte in the beginning of German Idealism, you can give a much more charitable reconstruction of what this passage means. And so that's sort of what I'm going to try to do in the next, I don't know how many minutes. But does anyone have any more questions up to this point about what's going on up to here? This is just standard reading of this passage, or maybe what used to pass as a standard reading of this passage.
I'll just say that what you're pointing out is actually a tendency of analytic philosophy, from what I can tell, at least coming from a department of analytic philosophers and having read a lot of analytic philosophy. It's they like to take one statement by one of these powerhouse thinkers, usually German or French, and then like write them off for this one statement. So Carnap does it with Heidegger with the nothing noths.
Yeah.
I had a professor who said that nothing Habermas writes is basically worth reading, because he basically is arguing that ethics comes from the fact that you can imagine other people feel things too, or something like, it was basically a sentence like that. And I remember just sitting there being like, what is this program?
Yeah, I think this is common. I honestly think it's common on the side of continental philosophers too. Like, for instance, Heidegger.
You're wrong.
I'm wrong? Yeah, maybe. But Heidegger does the same thing, I think, with the German Idealists. Like, Heidegger is willing to read maybe the first third of the Phenomenology of Spirit and be like, oh, see, it's all self-consciousness or something like that. When that's just the second section of the book, Heidegger sort of, I'm pretty sure I'm right about this, but from everything I've read, at least, Heidegger never talks about the end of Hegel books. I don't think that he like really finishes them or something like that. He's only.
I think that's right. And I mean, think about like with Nietzsche. I mean, as great as his interpretation is, in the 4 volumes, it's primarily focused on will to power. There's all these other works, that you could just as much Nietzsche's will to power, and you can argue that maybe will to power wasn't the greatest expression of Nietzsche's thought. So there's truth to what you're saying. They like to nitpick what they think is the true essence of a thinker.
Yeah, and so I don't know. For me, like, I don't think this happens in analytic philosophy specifically. I think they're like really smart, good readers of Fichte and the German Idealist tradition, the analytic tradition. I think that there are really bad ones. So too with the continental tradition. It's just an unfortunate way that I think some people avoid doing the really hard work of doing the history of philosophy. Yeah, so I don't think it belongs to one camp or the other.
I just love when I hear somebody say, well, the problem is Derrida and Baudrillard didn't believe in the physical existence of planets.
Yeah, like that's so. Well, Baudrillard, I have no idea. I don't want to pretend does some wild stuff sometimes, but I know at least for Derrida, like that's absurd.
Yeah.
And I'm sure it's probably absurd for Baudrillard.
Yeah, I mean, as much Baudrillard as I've read, I've never gotten the impression that he's like, nope, planets or simulation, buddy.
Yeah, I mean, it just comes off to me as a way of avoiding doing work, which fine, you know, we can't all do the history of philosophy, but don't try to pass it off as like, you know, like it's not worth reading. You just don't want to do it. That's fine.
Absolutely.
So yeah, so this is the reductive, really bad reading of Fichte. So like you might think, okay, well, what's the good one? Like what, you know, why should I bother if it seems like he's advocating this thing that's patently ridiculous? So here's a little incentive for why you might be interested in Fichte's thought. I think that a lot of trends in especially 21st century continental philosophy basically stem almost entirely from Fichte. Here's what I mean. When Purdue or Žižek or any number of other thinkers, Agamben, want to talk about the subject as a kind of void, as a kind of absolute negativity, as a cut in the real, or something like that, this is all basically Fichtean in origin. The idea that the subject is something fundamentally distinct from the kind of material nature that surrounds it, that it's kind of reflective structure that's unlike other things, and you can see this in like Sartre too. This is basically a Fichtean thesis. There are obviously premonitions of it. There are ways in which Descartes or Kant want to emphasize the importance of subjectivity and talk about how it's sort of fundamentally distinct, but from the things around it. But the idea that, especially to talk about the relationship between subject and negativity, is a starkly and robustly Fichtean thesis. Žižek has, for instance, owned up to this and basically said as much himself. If you're interested in all the stuff about negativity and the like in Hegel, I think ultimately it has its kind of origins in Fichte. You certainly don't find anything like it in Kant or a number of other thinkers that you might want to attribute it to. And so a lot of what I think a lot of contemporary continental philosophy is doing is rebranding and repackaging sort of Fichtean ideas. So too, I mean, I think more self-consciously, this is what Hegel is up to in the Phenomenology of Spirit, is a lot of what's going on there, not all of it, but a lot of it is in, I think, inspired by sort of Fichtean project. And so now that maybe we have some incentive to care about, think about what Fichte is up to, so what is the nature of that project? How exactly does he anticipate all this stuff about negativity, self-consciousness, all that kind of stuff? Okay, so we talked in the last time, we talked last time about how some skeptical problems with the Kantian account involved first, the sort of ambiguous status of freedom, at least in the first critique, right? On the one hand, freedom is something that is only problematic. In other words, we can't assert that we do have freedom, but we also can't assert that we don't. And this sort of leads problems with the account, because now we want to ask, how is the entire transcendental idealist system possible? How is it possible for us to reflect on our very cognitive capacities if we're not sure that freedom is real, if we're not sure that anything has this reflective capacity at all? And another similar problem dealt with the relation of the faculties and uncertainty regarding their potential unification. So why is the subject just in Kant this grab bag of different faculties? How is it that we can talk about how those faculties are unified or systematically articulated with respect to one another? Kant, at times, sort of like a typical 18th century philosopher, just sort of asserts that these faculties exist. But what is the route for unifying all these faculties? How can we understand them in relation to one another? And then the third problem is problems regarding the thing in itself, right? It seems like on the one hand, Kant is forced into saying that the thing in itself is the cause of our representations, but at the same time, there's difficulties because that's exactly what he said that you can't do, right? You can't talk about how things in themselves cause your representations because that's an illegitimate usage of the categories that are available to us. And so Fichte is alive during all these controversies. He's reading and engaging really closely with a lot of these texts that are really skeptical and critical of Kant. And what he wants to do is he wants to create a system of transcendental idealism. So he wants to remain faithful to the spirit of what Kant is doing, but he also wants to be able to solve what he sees are actually really good and legitimate arguments against the Kantian critical project. And so he wants to solve the three problems. First, a systematic account of a unified and free subject. And so one way to think about all of the post-Kantian German idealists is that they're trying to do something that you might think prima facie is impossible, which is to give a system of human freedom. So they want to explain how it is that freedom isn't just some leap of faith, that it's not just something that's factually given to you, but that freedom actually belongs in a systematic understanding of human knowledge. And so this is sort of at the basis of what Fichte will call his project throughout his career, the Wissenchaftslehre. So the sort of doctrine of knowing or scientific study of knowing or something like that. Important to keep in mind, scientific here as Wissenschaft doesn't mean anything like our contemporary understanding of science, which would be something like natural science. It just means highly organized system of knowledge. And so you'd just as well call like English, you know, like in English department, a science, a Wissenschaft, right? It doesn't only apply to kind of the natural sciences. And he wants to give a full and robust account that's unified in a way that the Kantian system isn't. And so with this sort of at the agenda of the problems that Fichte is responding to, one way of putting his project, and this is sort of based on, I meant to say this. One thing that's kind of confusing about what Fichte is up to is that he calls literally every book, every article that he ever writes a presentation of the Wissenchaftslehre. And so there's no one book that's called the Wissenchaftslehre, which would be nice and helpful, insane, you know. But instead, there's like 20 different presentations of the Wissenchaftslehre, all of which are like subtly different, which makes sort of getting into what he's up to really, really difficult and hard. But if you're interested, the book that I would recommend for getting into what Fichte is up to is in an English volume called Introductions to the Wissenschaftslehre. These were articles that Fichte wrote in, like, I think 1797. And so the purpose here is to introduce what he's up to a general audience. And then he was going to rewrite the whole thing, and he never got around to doing it. Surprise, surprise. But nonetheless, you know, it's pretty helpful for understanding it. This is especially important because what most people turn to, what like Fichte's contemporaries knew, is translated into English as the Doctrine of Knowledge, I think, or Doctrine of Science, I think, which is based on 1794. He like taught this in a seminar and then basically published his notes. And so it's extremely fragmentary and extremely difficult. Some people say that Fichte is really one of the first philosophers to like really make extremely technical work sort of in vogue in the continental tradition. And so that's super, super hard, and in a lot of ways unnecessarily hard, just because it's a completely unfinished work. You basically have an outline of a book where you should have a book. And so in general, I recommend against reading that, especially for your first text that you're going to read by Fichte. Instead, read these introductions, which are actually well written and written out and all that kind of good stuff. And so a lot of what I'm going to say is based on that version, because it's a lot more clear. There's a lot less jargon, all that kind of stuff. Okay, so in that text, Fichte starts with a manifest fact that certain representations that we have are necessary. There are necessary representations. You can't deny this. We see the world in basically similar ways. If we don't understand the same content, we at least have similar like modal categories. We have similar ways in which things are presented, you know, spatially and temporally. Our representations aren't just willy-nilly. They're not totally unstructured, but they are structured in a particular way, right? Fichte will sometimes refer to this as the standpoint of life. So this is like your unreflective way of just going about your everyday affairs. Stuff shows up in a certain way. It doesn't show up totally randomly, right? It's structured, right? And so the goal of philosophy, Fichte says, is to provide an account of your necessary representations. So we have these necessary representations, but what are they? And why are they this way rather than another way? Why are our necessary representations necessary? And so Fichte is going to say you have basically two avenues for explaining this. And I shouldn't say basically because I think he is committed to the belief that there are two and only two ways of explaining this. You can explain it by explaining that our necessary representations come from objects, or you can explain it by saying that our necessary representations come from subjects or ourselves, right? The first view they'll call dogmatism, and the second view they'll call idealism. Do you have a question?
So in the R and the U you're talking about, isn't that just sort of a structuralist assumption that the R is like fulfilling of all people and not just people inside of like a specific context from who's writing from? Or like how do you read the U and the R in that instance? Like where are you finding the pronouns there?
Yeah, so I think that Fichte would say that this holds for all subjects. So this holds for all human beings, minimally.
Okay.
It based on some Kantian stuff, you probably say, oh, like maybe angels or something like this have this structure too. If you wanted to move in the direction of saying like, oh, this is Western, this is Eurocentric or something like that, I think that what Fichte would say is like, okay, but it's not just for Western Europeans or people with Western European ancestry or something like that, that things show up in a certain structure. The question is that instead everyone's representations, because they're representations, show up in a certain structure. Now you might question or wonder whether this structure holds universally or something like that. And I think that those are legitimate concerns. But I think that Fichte is committed to the idea that it's just going to hold for everyone that's a representing being. In as much as you see stuff in a certain way. He hasn't said anything about what that way is or anything like that yet, but I think that this is just something that Fichte takes for granted. Stuff shows up one way or another, right? You have to represent something, right? You know, maybe you could get into interesting questions about like animal cognition or something like that. I have no idea what he would say in response to that kind of stuff. Is that helpful? Is that satisfying?
Like I mean, this is like 60 years before Marx would be writing like the German Ideology and all that. And I wonder what like a materialist reading of conditions, not like across the world, but also like across anywhere, would sort of put a little bit of a wrench in the idea that you can make a universal R and have one perspective and one view, sort of being or of the way in which things are seen or perceived. But yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, so I think that, so like one thing you might say based on what you just said is like, oh no, like certain economic conditions determine kind of how stuff shows up to us in one way or another. I think that, so Fichte is not committed to the idea that your representations always show up the same way all the time or something like that. He's going for a very, very basic minimal claim, which is just representations are structured in some way. And so it's totally consistent with the idea that the way that representations are structured comes from an economic base or something like that. I don't think at this point Fichte and Marx really have beef yet. But they will, just not like yet. Yeah.
Tyler, it's interesting to note that, Žižek as Marxist and Lacanian in Sublime Object of Ideology, one of the great passages is where he talks about how one of the problems with Marxist critique of ideology is that it's always seeking to show how some supposed universal feature is actually a historical particularity, historically generated. Whereas for him, to put a Lacanian spin on critique of ideology is to actually locate those universal structures that constantly keep repeating themselves throughout civilization. And, so part of a Lacanian critique of ideology would be locating these perturbing structures that just keep repeating themselves. For example, the Oedipus complex. The Marxist feminist type of reading would be, oh, see, it's this historical contingent configuration that takes on a guise of universality, whereas Žižek a la Lacan would say, no, let's see what this actual structure is behind the flow of history that keeps bringing this back, keeps reproducing it. It's like a symptom, right? It's this thing that we compulsively repeat. And, for the 20th century, he likes to point out how in capitalism, socialism, and fascism, all three had concentration camps. Well, what is this hidden underlying structure about 20th century civilization that repeated this horrible traumatic structure, right? And so I could see that, Fichte and some of the German idealists, this idea of universality is something that's inspiring Žižek in his very formation of what ideology critique should be about. It's not just, it's easy to go, this is historically constructed, let's show how it's historically constructed. For him, what's more radical is to see these deadlocks in our society that keep returning and have a kind of universality to them.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, and I don't want to get too contentious or whatever, I think this is already in the passage on commodity fetishism in Capital, where Marx will say some comments like, the commodity, one way in, it's not in a diamond or a pearl, that one way in which the way that you are deceived by commodity fetishism is you think that some ideal content is covering up some material content, but in reality he says that the reverse is the case, that you're confused by commodities because you fixate on their use value rather than their purely ideal content, which is going to be in their exchange value and stuff like that. Ultimately, yeah, I agree. I think all this stuff is really operative in the German idealist tradition, and yeah, I think it's in Marx, and I think most of the German idealists, this kind of concrete form of universality. But I think it might be like sketching out that and responding to all the criticisms and stuff like that might be too hard at this point. But is that helpful as at least like a starting point for why you might think that this is plausible in some way? Yeah. Okay. Okay. So we talked about how you start with, you have some representations, right? In some way. The question is, so you have two options. You have either those representations come from objects or those representations come from subjects. Why are these the only two options? These are the only two options because they either come from you or they don't. If they come from you, then you're an idealist, and if they don't, then you are a dogmatist. And so what I think a lot of 20th century continental philosophy would want to say here is like, oh, we need to think beyond the subject-object dichotomy. We need to get to some sort of prior concept of world or something like that, maybe in Heidegger, or some version of that kind of criticism, that subject-object distinction is unimportant. The way that Fichte deals with this kind of argument is to say, like, look, you're making this more complicated, basically, than you need to do. The point is all he's trying to say is self or other in some way, right? It doesn't need to be a Cartesian conception of objects. It doesn't need to be an early modern conception of objects. All it needs to be is there's some stuff that's not you, and that's the cause of your representations, or you cause your own representations. And then you have to give some weird account as to how that works. So that's why those are the only two options. There's no sort of like third option that you might want to go for as being prior to subject-object distinction or something like that, because he would just see that as a kind of dogmatism at best. You'd probably just say it's confused, I think, more than that. So these are the two options you have at this point. So why might you think, so he's going to try out the dogmatist hypothesis. So what are the problems with thinking that objects are the cause of your necessary representations? And so, you know, I see this book and it shows up as like green and rectangular and whatever else, right? And so it seems like the most straightforward thing to say is that this object, which is outside of me, is the cause of my representations, which are inside of me, right? And that's the most straightforward answer. And Fichte thinks that this is what you generally operate with in your everyday life. So the reason why this answer is untenable, and the reason why he wants to move you towards a form of idealism, is he wants to say that this runs into the exact same problem that is supposedly a problem with Kant. How can a thing in itself, an object, be the cause of your representations, right? The reason why this is a problem is that there's no reason why something just showing up makes it necessary for you as a subject, right? And so, you know, you might think of this as being similar to a sort of is-ought dichotomy, right? The very fact that they're suffering around you or something like that, it's not a reason for you to act yet until you decide that that's something that matters to you, right? And so without this kind of structure, without it mattering to you, it becomes a complete and total enigma how it is that an object can be the cause of your representations. And so it has a fundamental inability to answer the question for the exact same reason that people were skeptical of the Kantian account before. You might think that this is similar if the is-ought example wasn't as helpful. You might think that it's similar to problems in contemporary philosophy of mind. You might think that it's similar to the hard problem of consciousness. How is it that any single object can cause any kind of awareness? How is it that certain brain states can cause a mind or something like that? And Fichte thinks that you're just not, you don't have the equipment here in a dogmatist position to answer this kind of question. There's just a fundamental sort of disconnect, a fundamental inability to answer the question that's been posed within the dogmatist answer. So that's the problem with dogmatist answer. So what's the problem with the idealist answer? The problem with the idealist answer, you might think, is that, well, while the dogmatist found it difficult to explain how objects could cause my necessary representations, the idealist has the problem of explaining, why aren't things just the way that I think they are all the time? Why do I encounter any resistance at all in the world? Why is it that things aren't just the way that I imagine them to be? Why is there a disconnect ever between the way that I perceive things and the way that things are, right? And Fichte sees the entire history of philosophy as an attempt to answer or go through the strategy of dogmatism, and he wants to say the conceptual resources just aren't there. You just aren't going to be able to answer the question. We've had 2,000 years of trying to do this and failing. And so the real answer, the one that hasn't really been tried, is idealism. And importantly, this is not idealism in the way that it's normally understood, right? So ironically, on this account, Berkeley is a dogmatist. He's not an idealist. Why is he not an idealist? Because he says that God is the cause of your representations and God's not you, right? It's totally isomorphic with other kinds of accounts, right, that have been given, where the object or something outside of you is the cause of your representations. Fichte sees Kant as the only person that has ever taken up the idealist approach to answering this question. And so the only one at this point that's basically been on the right track to discovering the answer to the question, why do we have necessary representations? And Kant's answer is, we give them to ourselves. They're laws of our thought that we have to think, and we do so on the basis of human freedom. And so one reason why I love Fichte so much, and one reason why he's incredibly interesting to me, is Fichte basically thinks what we've tried to do in the total history of philosophy up to this point is see if we can recreate the world, use all these metaphysical tools, and then build up a world with human freedom within it, right? With our ability to represent things, with our ability to act, all that kind of stuff within it. And it's just been centuries upon centuries upon centuries of failure. And so his sort of genius move in some ways is, what if we just started from the fact of human freedom and tried to reverse engineer the fact that there's a world around us from that point, right? And this is kind of like crazy, and Fichte is just kind of willing to say, yeah, it kind of is. But the entire history of philosophy at this point has been a history of failure. And this is the only time where we seem like we were on the right track was with Kant. And Kant was the person that gave this kind of answer, which is that the categories, which are, the list of our necessary representations, the way that we have to think for stuff to show up, to be representable to us at all, is a law of our own consciousness. It's not something out there in the world or something like that. Importantly, though, that doesn't mean it's something made up, right? It's not like Kant thinks that all the categories are just something that you imagine and you can imagine them otherwise or something like that. The categories are objectively valid. They're necessary forms of thought. You can't think of any object without thinking of the categories, right? And so they aren't qualities of objects, but they are necessary features for any object to show up for you at all. And Fichte thinks, yeah, like that, we are finally making the right kind of moves. And so rather than ask the question, how do we get categories from objects and what kinds of categories are the right ones, Fichte thinks we need to start from the assumption of human freedom and then show what are the necessary postulates for us as subjects to be free and to be able to represent stuff around us. And so the entire Fichtean system is a way of, as I was saying, basically reverse engineering the entire world around us. 1 second, I need to plug in my laptop, sorry. Sorry about that. I saw that you had a question.
Oh, yeah. Well, I was just curious if Fichte does anything, any sort of like historical parsing out of the history of philosophy, because with what you're saying, it seems like, to put it in really simple terms, the history of philosophy is a history of looking outward to things and trying to then, reconstruct them and then prove, well, how can we fit into this world of things if we're reflective? And he's starting with like, no, we reflect or create or, in some sense, shape reality. And that seems to me to get to the original project of philosophy, which is to know thyself, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if like he does anything to say like this is kind of where things got off, or like does he see this as some sort of like not return to Plato, but like a different kind of footnote to Plato than everybody else has been positing up till then?
Yeah, so this is a good question. So one way in which I think, I'll talk about this a little bit more when I talk about the Hegel stuff too, but here's what you might think the oldest problem in the history of philosophy is. Parmenides, in his poem, talks about two ways of being, the way of doxa, or opinion, and the way of truth, or aletheia, right? And the problem is, how do we unite those two, right? How do we get an account of why it is that we have the opinions we do, but also what is the truth, right? And how can we reconcile the fact that those two things seem opposed to one another? And Parmenides doesn't really help you do that, at least in the fragments of the poem that we have. And what Fichte sees himself as doing is providing an account of the truth, which is, his Wissenchaftslehre, what he'll sometimes call the perspective of philosophy. And he wants to show how the perspective of philosophy can exhaustively explain our ordinary normal representations, which he calls like the perspective of life or something like that. But I think, so he doesn't give anything like a history of philosophy. One way that I think that you're right to locate him in a tradition with Plato is he wants to show how ideal categories, which are forms for Plato and there are categories for Fichte, inform and shape our everyday realities. But one way that I think that he would be different from Plato would be that, unlike Plato, he sees these categories not as separated off in a realm of their own or something like that, but the necessary practical postulates of human action or something like that. So I hope that's helpful, maybe.
Yep.
Are there any other questions up to this point? Okay, so now we're at the point where hopefully you're like, kind of going a little nuts, right? Like this seems like just absolutely the craziest, most like it seems like the hardest thing that you could do, right? You have to rebuild the world around you from the fact that you're a free being, right? And so the question shifts, right? The question is no longer how do objects become the cause of our representations, right? But instead the question is now, how is it that the self can be limited by itself? How is it that in our everyday activities, we aren't like, how is it that we're finite, right? How is it that we encounter objects which seem to resist us if sort of the fundamental fact that we have to operate on is our freedom, is our reflexivity, is our fundamental awareness of ourselves? And so Fichte's project in the Wissenchaftslehre is to give the necessary activity of human consciousness to be human consciousness at all. And so Fichte is not an absolute idealist or a subjective idealist in the sense that he thinks that everything is made up or in your head or something like that. Fichte thinks that for objects to be intelligible, you have to kind of give yourself certain laws, and that these are necessary, not just like you can accept them or you cannot, but they're just what it means to be a subject. And so there are a lot of people that say that Fichte is the first phenomenologist. He's the first person to say, these are the necessary postulates of consciousness. Here are the necessary ways in which consciousness operates such that objects can show up to you. And kind of here's what you should do about it, right? And so what this has sort of been leading up to is the I posits the not I. What does that mean? That means that while we begin with human activity, we begin with the fundamental fact, we'll call them Grundsätze, or like fundamental principles or something like that, fundamental laws of consciousness involve our human freedom. An equally fundamental law of human consciousness is that we are finite beings. There's really cool Lacanian stuff about this. Like Žižek says in Less Than Nothing that Fichte is the first materialist philosopher, which obviously is meant to kind of, you know, jab you a little bit, right? But the idea is just that he's the first person to say that negativity, that resistance, those are fundamental facts and features of self-consciousness. They're not just contingently given in certain objects that you see around you, right? And so Žižek will say stuff like Fichte discovered petit object A in his analysis of what he calls the Anstoß, which is the check or something like that. And another sort of meaning, it means both sort of impetus to action, but it also means like prevent, like it prevents you, like check in that kind of way, like stops you in some way. And so human action is something which exists necessarily in a finite world, and we have certain fundamental limitations on our consciousness and self-consciousness, and that this belongs to the reflexivity of what it means to be a subject. So we encounter ourselves both as lawgiver, as the subject who is reflexive and free and encounters a world, and also that which is given the law, that which, in order to be a subject at all, is structured in a certain way, encounters the world in a finite way, and is fundamentally unable of shifting, changing, altering, etc. These fundamental laws of human consciousness. And importantly, you should see the Kantian resonances here, especially with Kant's practical philosophy, right? For Kant's practical philosophy, the only way to be a free being is to give the law to yourself. Freedom isn't just willy-nilly doing whatever the hell you want, right? It's not just, oh, I'm hungry now, so I'm going to go to the store and I'm going to eat like garbage or something like that. Or freedom is my ability to choose which cereal box I'm going to get or something like that, right? That's a just utterly shallow understanding of what human freedom is. You're just being utterly determined by your own sensibility, and in this case, the way that others are going to shape your sensibility, as in capitalist relations and stuff like that. Instead, what real freedom is, both for Kant and Fichte, is the ability to give the law to yourself. And Fichte sees this not only as a practical postulate, something that you do whenever you're engaging in moral activity, but he thinks that's just what it means to be a subject, is to be fundamentally split and divided between the law-giving and the law-given subject. And so when he says that the not I is posited by the I, what he means is that resistance, negativity, the check, the Anstoß, all those things are just as fundamental as your human freedom to self-consciousness. And so rather than say, you know, what the standard reading is that we talked about before, that here Fichte is getting rid of all human finitude, he's getting rid of everything that would function as a check or an impetus to human activity, he's instead saying, no, that's actually what it means to be both human and a free subject. He thinks that it's just confused to think that anything that is free is not finite in this way. He'll even say stuff like, not even God could make a being free, right? Because it's something fundamentally that the subject has to do to themselves. It can't be something external in that way. And so, contra the standard reading, what's going on when Fichte says that the I posits the not I is just that to be a subject is to be a finite subject and to be a limited subject in a way that we don't often recognize, anticipate, or understand. And so there's maybe more stuff to be said about Fichte. Well, I'm sure there is. Like one thing, just as an example, you might think this is too individualistic or something like that. Fichte gives a proof of other minds. Kant never gives anything like this in his entire career. Fichte, one of the laws of self-consciousness is that there are other self-consciousnesses. Fichte doesn't think it's even coherent to talk about a single self-consciousness, for example. And so contra the reading that we talked before, you know, where there's only just one subject and that subject just makes everything up, right? Fichte's saying the exact opposite here. In order for human freedom to make sense, to be sensible as an option, there have to be multiple self-consciousnesses. They have to reciprocally limit and determine one another. They have to be determined by the objects around them, all that kind of stuff. And so that's all I really wanted to do as far as the Fichte stuff. I don't know if there are any lingering questions about what he's up to or what's going on at this point. I know I have a lot. So,
hey, Tyler, if we were to reword his formula, the I posits the not I, could we say the I imposes its own limitations? Is that what we're saying here?
I think so. The only hesitation that I would have is that imposes seems to imply that it could like choose not to, or something like that. But it can't, right? That's sort of part of the structure of his argument.
So the I necessitates its own limitations.
Yeah, the I, or you can even say the I is its own limitations, or something like that.
Okay.
Like that.
Yeah, because posits definitely sounds like it's a choice or something like.
Yeah, that word sounds too active almost.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, so part of the reason why it's active is because it still has to be in action of human freedom, right? It's not like you're an object. This isn't just like a quality that you have amongst other qualities, right? It's not like I'm like, oh, you know, I am white and wearing a blue shirt and also I'm free or something like that, right?
It's a necessary activity. It's something we do, but we have to do.
Right, yeah. Alan Wood has a really good gloss on this. He says something like, the self is the demand that it makes on the self, or something like that, a demand that it makes on itself. Which I think nicely sort of points out how Fichte, in some ways, gets everything into self-consciousness, but only by cracking or splitting or the subject from itself. There becomes this kind of, you know, Žižek says stuff like Fichte totally anticipates the idea of the split subject.
Well, I was just curious, and this is might be sound a little more like just semantics, but I was curious how maybe not semantics but classification, but how does the body itself relate to the I and the other, wherein we know that, the body can change the consciousness. We know, of course, that it is the finiteness of the body which necessitates the limitations upon the I, which give human freedom according to Fichte, but wherein there can be changes within the body itself which can change the consciousness. And is that an object relation, or is that a self relation when the body itself changes consciousness, such as brain damage or disease or other
Mushrooms.
Yeah.
This is a good question. This is another instance, I think, where Fichte is much more materialist than Kant. Fichte actually has a proof that rational beings have to have a body. And so he says stuff like, part of the structure of self-consciousness is that you have the ability to act on objects, and for you to do that, you have to have a body.
Shit out of luck.
That's
like God is shit out of luck, huh?
Yeah, exactly. So part of what happens in 1799 is that he writes this text and he's like, well, what we really understand by God is really just the moral law. There's no guy up there in the sky or anything like that. That's all just kind of metaphysically silly. And then he gets called an atheist, and then he gets expelled from Jena and goes to Berlin, and then becomes kind of like a super religious nut afterwards, and it's really kind of sad. But
God has a body. It's the bread you eat.
That's true.
But this is just to say that, this is one way in which, he says that God can't do a whole bunch of stuff, right? And it can't even really exist as a free being because God doesn't have a body, right? But to get back to the question, so Fichte's proof that you have a body is a little bit more complex than that, but that's the basic structure of the argument. You might not think that he has a robust enough conception of the body, because he sees the body as a kind of vessel that kind of carries around the I. And he'll also say kind of weird stuff like, you have a moral obligation to look after your body, and to he kind of treats your body like it's some vessel or something like that from the I. But he's perfectly willing to say stuff like, your body, when you get sick, he thinks when you eat too much and stuff like that, you can make yourself sick and a moral degenerate, right? And it's not really clear how this reciprocal causation is supposed to work. He's not always super clear about this, but normally he is aware you do have a body, you have to have a body to be an I, and you have moral obligations towards your body, which are not moral obligations toward yourself exactly. So I think that one way of putting it is that Fichte probably wouldn't say that you are your body, but he would say that you have a body, and that this is necessary and important, and stuff you do to your body can affect you in a more robust way. That might be unsatisfying, but that's Fichte's account as I understand it.
So the body is kind of a synthesis of the I and the other, wherein the other can act upon the self and the self can act upon the other, but the body is not one or the other.
I think that's probably right. Or maybe he's ambiguous on the question. Your material body is you in a certain sense, and it's the way that you interact with all the other stuff. But he's not willing to just straight up identify you with your body or something like that. If you're in a Merleau-Ponty or something like that, this is just not going to cut it, right? But I think if you're more akin to Husserl or something like that, then maybe this is good enough account of the body.
So I have a question for clarification, and it might be a good segue out of this section. I don't know. So, you had said there were 3 problems he was primarily concerned with, and that he had these 3 basic solutions for them. and I don't remember what the problems were. I didn't write it down, and I want to. And then I think that you said the systematic account of human freedom and subjectivity, is that what it was? Is his solution for the first one. And I think that's what we all just talked about for this whole time. Did we talk about the other two? Is that other time?
So briefly, but yeah. So the three problems with the Kantian account. First, ambiguous on the question of human freedom. Here, Fichte is totally unambiguous, right? We're fundamentally free beings. This is the beginning of any system of human cognition that you can set up, right? The second is a sort of uncertainty with respect to the faculties and all the stuff that faculties do and how they do them. And so here we haven't really gone as much into the super nitty-gritty details of what sort of stuff that Fichte says that the I has to posit. But we've kind of talked about it has to be a systematic project, and you have to talk about all the stuff that's necessary for you to posit to be a subject. And so one way that Fichte puts his project, which is super weird, but also really interesting, is he says that he's giving a pragmatic history of the human mind. And what he means by that is he's giving an account of all the stuff you had to do before you entered time to be a subject. So all these free activities, all that kind of stuff that you had to do that were part of what it means to be you, that you did like before you entered time. So, you know, it's a transcendental, not an empirical account of subjectivity. So this is, you know, all the stuff for what it means to be a subject. It's not something empirically, it just happens in time. But they're also activities, because they're actions, they're human freedom, right? They're not like just qualities that you would have in an object or something like that. And so that's number two, have to give a systematic account. And then the third one was problems with a thing in itself. And the thing in itself is just gone. There is no thing in itself. Instead of having a thing in itself, some people think that the thing in itself and the NotI are like the same thing, but they're clearly not, right? For Kant, the thing in itself is something outside of all human cognition, something that you don't have the ability to grasp or deal or to know in any way, even if you can think about it. For Fichte, the NotI is the exact opposite. It's something that is fundamental to all human activity whatsoever. You know it all the time, right? You're engaging with it all the time. And so his solution to the problem of the thing in itself is to get rid of the thing in itself and point out how the problem of transcendental affection, so how it is that an object can affect you, is a problem with all dogmatist accounts, not a problem with all idealist accounts. So yeah, that just briefly, those were the three problems and the three kinds of solutions.
Sweet.
Any last things on this? Okay, so the next part is a lot easier, right? I'm no longer going to tax you with some crazy idealist stuff. I'm instead just going to give you very, very practical tips, tricks, and strategies for dealing with reading the Phenomenology of Spirit, which can seem like a very difficult and obtuse and unnecessarily arcane text. One thing that I'll mention that I said before in the last time is that part of the reason why the German idealist tradition is so hard is just because so much philosophy happens in such an incredibly short period of time, and it's normally like kind of covered over when you do like history of modern philosophy seminars. They can be really hard to keep up with, like, what are the problems that are being dealt with even in this kind of passage. And so I would encourage you to kind of be patient with Hegel. You know, he does a lot of weird stuff in the Phenomenology of Spirit, but there's a reason why, you know, we're still reading it 200 years later and all that kind of stuff. And And so the problems at times can be kind of hard. But here's the most general, basic problem of the phenomenology of spirit, and also how it ties into the Fichte stuff that we talked about earlier. So Fichte wanted to finally give an explanation of our ordinary consciousness from the perspective of philosophical consciousness. He wanted to explain, here's why we have the necessary representations that we do in our ordinary life, and let me provide a robust transcendental explanation for them, right? The problem in the phenomenology of spirit, or at least one way of talking about the problem in the phenomenology of spirit, is to think of it as very much in the same tradition. Hegel wants to show how ordinary consciousness, so the most ordinary basic way of thinking that you can possibly engage with, by its own light, not through something external. It's not like you just want to do philosophy because you're a nerd or something like that, and that propels you into this weird systematic explanation or something like that. He wants to show how ordinary consciousness in itself moves into philosophical consciousness. So he wants to show how and why our ordinary everyday thinking, all roads lead to Hegel. Right? He wants to show why it is that us thinking in our most basic terms relies on the conceptual categories that he's going to develop somewhat in the phenomenology of spirit, but then much more explicitly and robustly in the science of logic, which is why he calls the phenomenology appropriate to the science of logic. So that's kind of the fundamental problem. So like, why does our ordinary perspective lead to this weird Hegelian view? And this is a problem, as I mentioned, that's as old as Parmenides, right? Parmenides' two paths in that poem, right, are the path of dogma and the path of truth, right? And so Hegel is trying to give a unified path. He's trying to show how dogma leads into truth, and how truth has a fundamental account of dogma and itself, right? So some other tips. The phenomenology is not a linear historical story. It's not going to start at the beginning of time, and it's not going to be, it's not like a linear account of stuff that happens in history. If you try to develop an account like this, things are going to get really weird for you really fast. Because earlier on in the book, Hegel is going to be talking about Stoicism and skepticism. And then later he's going to be talking about stuff in Antigone, right? And there's a bunch of chapters in between them, right? Like it just doesn't, it's not going to make sense if you try to read it as a linear historical account. It's instead an account of the types of thought determinations that you have. So he wants to move from the most basic kind of conceptual thought that's available to you to the most robust, most concrete, most important kind of conceptual content that's available to you at the end. But that doesn't map on exactly historically. And he doesn't really care that it doesn't map on historically, right? Sometimes people in the ancient world are much more aware and interesting and exciting than people that are around him. He certainly feels this way about like Aristotle. He thinks like Aristotle is basically the smartest person who ever lived and the proto-Hegel in almost every way, right? Hegel just gets to be better because he came after Kant or something like that, right? So it's not a linear historical narrative. And then further, kind of as a consequence of this, there are never going to be one-to-one correspondences between a chapter of the Phenomenology of Spirit and a certain philosopher or a certain historical event or something like that. The closest thing that you get to a one-to-one correspondence is that Hegel talks very explicitly about the French Revolution and the French Terror. That seems like that's one-to-one. But in almost all cases, like it would be I think it would be really mistaken for you to be like, oh, you know, this section of the Phenomenology of Spirit about perception isn't about Kant because the chapter on forcing understanding is about Kant or something like that. Like that's just kind of a mistake. Like there are all sorts of different sort of conceptual categories, we'll call them thought determinations, that show up in the phenomenology and get critiqued, and they show up all sorts of different places, right? Just as an example, the first chapter of the Phenomenology of Spirit is called Sense Certainty, and it's just trying to be the most basic thing possible. So what really exists? That really exists. You don't even say anything about its properties. You don't say like, oh, it's silver and it's red or anything like that. You just say that thing right there, right? And maybe you could try to say like, oh, this is like ancient cognition or something like that, but that just is kind of mistaken. Hegel's just as much talking about his contemporaries as he is talking about like he had a random peasant woman who he points out is a recipient of this criticism as anybody else, right? And so don't look for one-to-one correspondences.
I read it this afternoon, actually, and this section you're talking about, and it's what came to mind when Michael was asking the question about Fichte. I didn't know about Fichte, but I do know in terms of like Hegel, that part of what you're pointing out, how this applies just as much to the peasant woman as it does someone else 1,000 years ago or whatever. He's like stripping things down to like the most fundamental, like, yeah, unarguably though, anybody at least has experienced this.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
Experience the fact that there is this thing that they're like, that's that, right? And like, it's, I don't know, it's actually like the preface and the introduction. The preface was insanely hard. The introduction was a bit easier. And then the first chapter, I'm like, oh, that's not bad at all.
Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think that's most people's experience. Some people read the preface at the end because it's like, you know, written after you'd written the whole book. I don't really care. Some people are really hardcore about that. I think it's like whatever. Like you put it at the beginning of the book, and that's the same as like any other preface. So like, but yeah, the preface is super hard. And then
so said that the preface, introduction, and then the chapters that basically make up the first 130 pages of the book is like the heart of the whole project, and the rest of it's kind of playing out through history or whatever. Does that sound right?
So
I might be misquoting him too.
Yeah. So some people think this, right? Okay. So originally, the book was going to be called "The Science of the Experience of Consciousness," right? By the way, this sounds really, really Fichtean, right? It sounds exactly what Fichte was talking about. All the stuff self-consciousness has to do to be a subject, whatever, right? Systematic account, right? So that was the original project of the book, right? And Hegel was going to end it at the very end of the reason chapter of the Phenomenology of Spirit, which I think is a little bit more than 130 pages, but something like that, right? And then he stops after he thinks he finished the book. It's like, wait, no, I have to actually, like, I haven't really finished. And then he writes the chapter on spirit and religion. And this is where maybe things get really confusing, because spirit restarts the apparent historical sequence. It goes all the way back to Antigone. And then you get a more or less linear historical cycle right after Hegel had basically already gone through a historical cycle. And then he does the same thing in the religion chapter. He starts time all over again, right? And each time when he's like restarting the historical narrative, he says something like, well, we weren't really in a place to appreciate the importance of this historical development, but now we are, so let's like run it through again, right? And he even says this at the very end of the book. He's like, well, you weren't really in a place to appreciate the arguments that were made earlier, but now you are, so like go and reread it. Yeah. So,
like essence of continental philosophy right there.
Yeah, it's pretty obnoxious, right? But yeah, so like, so the way that some people think about this, some people think, oh, he like basically had a very coherent book up until the spirit chapter, and then he like goes fucking crazy and like writes this other half, and we can basically ignore it. It's just his weird political observations about stuff through history or something like that. I think his view is like really fundamentally mistaken and misguided. I think that he wrote the second half of the book for a reason, and that to give a totally complete explanation would be a little bit out of place here, but he talks in the very beginning of the chapter on spirit where he says, hey, well, we didn't really understand anything that we were doing before, and that's a really huge problem. So we need to restart. And he says stuff like, all of the other forms of consciousness that we've been through up to this point were really spirit. We just didn't realize it yet. But now we need to like go through now realizing that fact, right? And so to bring it back to sort of what I said the original problem was, spirit sort of becomes more aware of itself and its own activity. And so it's like, wait, what was I thinking? What was I doing the whole time in the last, 200 pages? And so, yeah, it does that. It does that both at the spirit section and the religion section, which is like super obnoxious, right? Like, he not only restarts the historical narrative twice in the book, he then at the end of the book is like, oh yeah, and like go ahead and reread that. So he basically wants you to go through the historical sequence 6 times before you really understand it. That's Hegel for you, I guess. Oh yeah, and then read the Science of Logic, and then reread the Science of Logic, right? That's more than one lifetime's worth of reading, probably, at that point. But yeah, that's what he tells you to do. So obviously, it's no expectation that you actually go and do all of that. But this is just to say that Hegel's really weird, right? And he's doing like a bunch of weird stuff in the phenomenology. And that while it would be really comforting for us, if it were a historical trajectory and it stopped in 1807, and we could just map chapter for chapter onto a historical figure, unfortunately, it's a lot more complicated and weird and cyclical than it allows us to do. And so, yeah, hopefully that's helpful. So, yeah, some people think that the spirit section of the book was like a mistake. Some people even said that he was getting really drunk all the time, and that's why you wrote the spirit section. But I think all that stuff's super misguided. I think it's like, actually, he's right when he says you didn't really understand anything that you were doing up until that point. But that's my view.
And no, the way you explain it, it makes total sense. And I've also heard this described as like, he's not, he hasn't developed some grand project and here it is. It's like, this is thinking coming into its own self-realization, and that therefore it's going to be like this folding process. It's like this dawning realization. And it's like, oh, then the form matches the content.
Yeah, exactly. That's totally right. So like one thing that you might expect, you might think that the Phenomenology of Spirit is the most disappointing book in the entire history of philosophy. Here's why you might think that. You might think, well, Hegel just gave me 500 pages of extremely obscure stuff about why every other view is wrong, and then I read Absolute Knowing, and then he didn't really say very much other than like read the logic. And now I'm mad. Like he just told me why everyone else is wrong, but he didn't really give me an account of what is right or something like that. But the point for Hegel is that in realizing how each thought determination previously was self-contradictory or something like that, you realize why it was necessary for history to move the direction that it did, or why the thought determinations and the phenomenology had to move the way that they did. And so you're not going to get some account of like all the fundamental categories or something like that at the end, because you already did it, right? You already did all the hard work of figuring out all the fundamental thought determinations and how they exist in relation to one another. You just did that already, right? And so, you know, with Hegel, you always get this weird, it never comes, but it's always already there, sort of temporality where you never are exact. Hegel's all like Plato, where it's very unclear where he's talking in his own voice, right? And Hegel would just say, well, learning about the mistakes of all the previous thought determinations, all the previous figures of consciousness, that just is absolute knowing. It's not like there's some extra doctrine that's different from all that stuff. You did it. You're there, right? And so while in some sense that's supposed to be disappointing, in another way, it's supposed to be kind of liberating. You know, it's not like, importantly, absolute knowing isn't going to be like, you know, some doctrine that's like different than all the other ones. It's just the process of thought thinking itself, as you were saying, and going through all these different stations and figuring itself out part by part. There's no, and it has to go through those stages. That's why there's not just some separate chapter that's like, and here's Hegel's view, or something like that. Hegel's view just is this interpretation of the history of philosophy. So
that's already how I write, and it's not acceptable. I'm not saying I'm just saying that, like, yeah, making like a extracting the actual principles that you're trying to say, listing them always feels wrong. I'm like, what? Can I just show you how I thought about this? And then pay for president.
I mean, closest thing you get to like a positive account is the science of logic, but he's going to do the exact same thing there that he did in the phenomenology. He'll get rid of all the very helpful historical references. He'll get rid of all of the representational stuff that might have helped you understand it, and just give you the most bare bones logical content that's carried in each. And so it's not like, oh, the logic's finally going to tell me, you know, what was going on earlier. If anything, it's going to be like, well, you did the phenomenology, but I made that really easy for you. You know, I gave you all this help. And now I'm going to take that away, and you get to go do it again. And that's what the science of logic is. And so, yeah, I mean, it's just kind of this view that doing philosophy is just doing the history of philosophy. It's not like there's any extra thing that you do after, right? If you just do the history of philosophy, well, then you're doing philosophy. Yeah, that's the Hegel view. It's not like thought is something different than thought in its activity, right? This is, again, we can see the resonances of a very Fichtean view. Thought isn't something static. It's not like you can give it in principles or prefaces or laws. It's something that's inherently kinetic, dynamic, something that you have to see all the various stages and you go through them, all that kind of stuff, which is, you know, that's really influential in continental philosophy.
Yeah. I wonder how, I mean, like, because Hannah Arendt, cognition and thought are two different things, where cognition is the sort of application of not principles, but like, or formulas, but like, kind of like tracks of thought that were previously thought and then like sort of encapsulated, right? So cognition is, for instance, the ability to think in, you know, traditional logic, or to do mathematics, or to apply a pre-existing way of thinking to something. So like, I'm going to take Derrida to this text, or something like that. Whereas thought is free movement, and it's very hard. You can't express it necessarily in categories of language all the time, pre-given categories of language, because it is something that pushes you into mentality, like into the new, right? And so that sounds like something she kind of lifted from Hegel.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that, so, yeah, I think that for Hegel, the idea is just, well, if you just do the history really well, and, you know, it's not exactly history. If you do the Phenomenology of Spirit really well, then you basically already know the logic. You already know all the stuff that's going to be in the encyclopedia, you know, all of that kind of stuff. And it all works the same way, right? And so on your rendition, just cognition either leads to or just is thought, assuming you're doing it well or something like that. And then something kind of playing off what you were saying earlier is just that there's nothing like a general methodology to the Phenomenology of Spirit, or at least I don't think there is. So some people try to give, oh, there's thesis, antithesis, synthesis, or Hegel takes some category and then does X, Y, Z to it or something like that. For the life of me, I just don't think this exists. I don't think there's anything like a general methodology that applies to everything in the Phenomenology of Spirit. And that's good, right? Like Hegel's making different, unique arguments every time. There's no reason why we should expect that there's some one-size-fits-all kind of methodology for reading Hegel. The closest thing to this is that what Hegel's going to try to do is he's going to try to show that we begin with the most basic presuppositionless kind of ordinary consciousness, and then we're going to show that there's a contradiction here, right? And then we're going to get a new understanding of consciousness that attempts to, in some way, overcome the difficulty of the previous one, right? And so they necessarily lead into one another in that way. But this isn't really a method, right? It's not like there's any one problem that all of them have that Hegel is going to solve or something like that. He criticizes them all in all sorts of different ways, right? And the closest thing, I think, to a methodological criteria is he says that they're all immanent criticisms. So it's not like Hegel has his own standards of truth and rightness or something like that, and then all these various figures of consciousness don't meet it. They don't match up until you get to Hegel, and then he finally does, right? You get to absolute knowing, and then finally we get the one that meets the mark or something like that. Instead, it's that the very notion of truth for each one changes. So when you change figures of consciousness, you're changing what it means to be true, right? So in sense certainty, we just try to say appear like this right here, and we don't refer to any of its qualities because that's the most basic thing that we could possibly do. And this is the best moment of consciousness because it's totally concrete, right? There's nothing abstract about it. I'm not using any big words at all. But saying just this can apply to anything, right? And so it's actually the least concrete thing because it's just a totally abstract conceptual category, right? That's real rough and dirty first moment of consciousness and sense certainty. But you can see the move here, right? It's not like Hegel has his own standard for what sense certainty has to do. He's just saying, taken on its own terms, it can't even do the shit it wants to do, right? It can't do the very thing, it can't know the very thing that it's trying to know, right? It just can't do it based on its own terms. And this is what's going to happen with every single figure of consciousness, which is why there's no general methodology, because that would be just something external, extrinsic, and it wouldn't be a good criticism of any of these figures of consciousness, right? It has to come from within their own standards to be a good criticism. And so that's going to be, in general, the closest thing to a methodology that's available. And that's just kind of describing the structure of the book. It's not really saying anything about the nature of the arguments. Yeah. And then one last thing that I would recommend is that I think that some people think that you should really avoid secondary literature when you read the history of philosophy. they're like, oh, you just engage with the text or something like that. In general, I'm not a fan of this approach. I think secondary literature is often very helpful if it's good, especially considering that a lot of the problems that Hegel's responding to are difficult or obscure. And so good secondary literature is actually quite helpful in figuring out what the problem is. And so I think it's more helpful than most people think. I think the best book about the phenomenology of spirit that goes section by section is Hippolyte's book. That I think it's Structure and Genesis in Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. Let me make sure. One sec.
I was reading it today. By Hippolyte.
It's Genesis and Structure, actually. I got the two reversed. So yeah, I think that's the most helpful book. There are other ones. There's a couple more that I've read, but none of them were as helpful as this book. It's really good.
It's also really useful to read Hippolyte so Hippolyte and Kojève are the two, basically the two people who everyone in the 20th century French scene learned their Hegel through.
Yeah.
Right. So it's like especially useful for understanding folks like Derrida.
Yeah, definitely. You'll notice that a lot of stuff in Deleuze and Derrida and Foucault is all about two words, structure and genesis. There's a reason for that. They all had Hippolyte as their mentor for their dissertations. So yeah, it's really helpful for doing double duty that way. Hippolyte is just like super good. I think his logic book is kind of meh, but this book is probably the single most helpful Hegel book that I've ever read. I think it's really good.
Hard.
And then the last thing that I would recommend is whenever I read the Phenomenology of Spirit with an instructor, what he encouraged me to do is that for every chapter I read, be able to say what the central kind of antinomy or contradiction was in that section. So what is it trying to do and why can't it do it, right? Just in the most basic sense. Articulate that, and then articulate how the next section is supposed to be a resolution of that problem. I think this is the most basic way, the most helpful, fruitful way of trying to get at Hegel in general. Every chapter, there's going to be a problem and a purported solution to that problem. And then almost always Hegel's argument is that solution doesn't work. And then he says some reasons why. And then you're like, well, okay, then we need a reformulation of what the problem is. And then you move on to a new station of consciousness. And that's how the book goes in general. So to use the example from earlier with the sense certainty stuff, so it's like, okay, I want to be as concrete as possible, so I just say this, right? But that's really abstract. And so what should I do? Well, I should start describing it, right? If I start describing it, then it's different from other stuff, and that's less abstract. So I say, oh, it's silver and it's red and it's blah, 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 right? And then I moved from sense certainty, which is all the stuff about the pure this, to perception, which is about a thing and its many qualities, or something like that. And then you can get a pretty clear picture of how the phenomenology is moving. Because it's really easy to just get lost in all the Hegelese, right? In itself, for us, blah, blah, blah. In general, I don't think any of that stuff is very helpful. Other Hegel people will say that stuff at me sometimes, and normally I can follow. But to me, I think that what Hegel did throughout his whole career was turn philosophical problems into his own idiom. And I think if you can't do that, then you don't really understand what's going on, right? And so being able to articulate in your own words what the problem is, how that figure of consciousness is meant to be a solution to it, and then how that fails and how you get the new one, that's going to be the best avenue for reading the book chapter by chapter.
Tyler, would you say that after your all the work you've done on the book, that the hardest chapter or section is still Force and the Understanding?
Yeah, I think so. It's either that one or it's the culture section in Spirit. But I think that the reason for why they're hard is different. Force and the Understanding, so that's the third chapter of the Phenomenology of Spirit. This is where like 90% of the people that give up. It's like super hard. It's like based in like certain Kantian and Schillingian understandings of forces and how they work. And so most people at this point are just like, all right, I'm done. Like I don't want to do this anymore. This isn't fun. Which is reasonable in some ways. So that chapter is really hard. And then there's one in the Spirit section that's like kind of about this book by Diderot that I've never read and still haven't read to this point. And so it's just hard because it's like very heavily referential, and I don't know the reference yet. I've been meaning is it Rameau's Nephew, I think, is the text that it's really about. I haven't read it. I mean to. I will one day, but I just haven't. And so that section of the Phenomenology of Spirit is super hard because it's very, very referential in a way that I don't understand. But I think Force and the Understanding is the hardest because it's the hardest to understand the arguments. And it's actually important to understand Hegel, which, you know, it's kind of rough. You can't just like skip it or something.
Rock and roll. I think we're just about at time. Does anyone have like a final question?
I guess I'll go forward with one. I've had it claimed to me that Hegel writes deliberately confusingly to kind of make himself seem smarter and the ideas he's talking about more profound. I was just curious if you agree with that or disagree with that, and if you agree with that, if you have any tips on kind of clarifying the language.
Yeah, so I disagree with that. I think this way about every philosopher in the canon is that they are struggling at the very limits of intelligibility, right? They are struggling mightily to articulate something that has never been articulated before in the entire Western tradition, right? Or at least has never been articulated as fully as whatever, right? And so Kant is really hard, right? But Kant is also giving us so much new shit, right? He's giving us new developments in theoretical philosophy. He's giving us new developments in epistemology. He's giving us new developments in moral philosophy. He's giving us new developments in anthropology and political science, blah, 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 right? And I think that the same thing is there for Hegel, right? You're struggling at the very limits of what we can say and how we can say it, right? And that just makes it intrinsically really difficult. And then compounded with that, Hegel is using a language that we don't use anymore, namely the sort of philosophical jargon of the early 19th century, right? And so he's referencing Goethe, who we don't read. He's referencing Schelling, who we don't read. He's referencing Fichte, who we don't read, right? And he's arguing with all these sort of figures that not only have we forgotten, but that we don't even remember that we've forgotten, right? And so I think that part of the difficulty with Hegel's language is, number one, just how original he's being. But then number two is also just like that he's dealing with a tradition that we so very rarely read in any depth. And so it's natural to us, now that we've moved beyond that kind of language, that way of talking, to view it as totally alien. And then once we see it as alien, it's really easy to say then that, oh, they knew what they were doing. They just wrote that way on purpose and stuff like that. There's also various sort of phrases in Hegelese that are common in German that just aren't common in English. It's like for itself, für sich, right? Or in itself, or, you know, all the thing itself. All these are sort of German idioms that are almost untranslatable, right? They're like, that's basically the best we got. And so I think it's really hard. I'm totally willing to give the critics that, but I think that there are much better explanations for why it's hard than, you know, Hegel wants us to all think he's really profound, and he's actually not.
Yeah, why would you write that long of a book just so people thought you were profound?
Yeah, I mean, you could have done. It would have been a lot easier. Right?
A shorter book.
Isn't that Ayn Rand's entire like idea?
Wow.
Well, you can't disagree.
You could probably find a way to disagree with it.
Oh,
I know. It's just amazing that like Animal Farm did in like what 20 pages what Rand wants to do in like 700. It's like, yeah, we get it. 20 pages could have said things.
Yeah, I mean, Ayn Rand isn't even saying something that's worth saying in 20 pages, right? I don't know. Anyway. Ayn Rand is struggling at the limits of intelligibility, not because she's saying something new, but because she's almost saying something unintelligible.
Roasted.
Yeah, it's like when someone really wants to justify something they're attached to, and that's more what it feels like. And
yeah.
I mean, also there are a lot of people who write philosophy that seems to be intentionally confusing, but most of the time I think it's because they're trying to fulfill a research requirement or grad school requirement or whatever, and so it's just trying to fill pages. And if you're a Hegel, no one's telling you to do it, so you're sitting there like
I mean, Hegel's actual academic career, like he was like basically a principal at an elementary school when he was writing The Science of Logic. He did not have and he was teaching it to children, by the way, which should have been stuff from The Science of Logic. And then also like, oh, the latrines are broken, I have to go fix them. Like, yeah, you don't do that to impress people, right?
Sorry, that really needs to be a movie.
Totally.
Hegel is my teacher.
Yeah.
That makes me want to be an elementary school teacher.
Principal Hegel.
Hegel, why am I in trouble?
Well, honestly, one of the things that I really liked about the preface and the introduction is the pedagogue in him comes out. You see the teacher in him because he goes on rants about people who say things just to sound profound, and it's just this kind of industry of edification. And he's like, "This is fucking bullshit. We need rigor. We need to like have concepts that are like founded on things that actually make sense of that, like of these domains that you want to like be able to talk about." So, and there's also this thing that he does. What I'm going to do is, because I don't want to do this right now, but what I will do is I'm going to send y'all something that, because Sammy said the thing about free thought versus the kind of fixed structures, and there's this like 5 pages in the preface where he basically is saying most of the knowledge that you're given as knowledge is not thought, it's not thinking, and it's just kind of it's the cheap version of this critique is that, oh, we're all taught to regurgitate but not how to think critically. He's saying that in more elaborate terms, but he's also getting at something deeper that is trying to get to, and he lays that out in like you see like all these like ways that plays out, and it's really cool.
Yeah, my favorite moments actually in the whole German Idealist tradition are where they get really catty. Hegel's really good at doing this. Hegel is really, really good at insulting people. So is Fichte, by the way. Fichte said that his entire so a lot of Fichte's criticisms of people is you're a dogmatist, not only because like you've messed up in these theoretical commitments, but also because you're lazy, right? You want to take responsibility for who you are, and you want to attribute this all to your circumstances or something like that, and it's basically because you're a horrible, lazy person, in addition to being a failed philosopher. And so he'll just have these absolutely sick burns of people. And Hegel will do the same thing, basically. But yeah, and I think that one thing that's important about both Hegel and Fichte is that they are the anti-mystics par excellence, at least in my view. They want to say that if you're not saying something concrete, you're not saying anything at all. And that what you're doing is just fundamentally uninteresting if it's just sort of edifying mystic babble. And that's just sort of part of their commitments. In some ways, despite the fact that Hegel himself is so difficult and hard to understand, he's committed to the idea that anything you can say clearly, which is hard sometimes, but he sees himself as trying to do that in the idiom of his times, right? And I don't know, I'm just fundamentally convinced that that's right, and that you should be trying to say stuff as clearly as you possibly can so that you don't become one of these people that's just passing off nonsense in, you know, ridiculous language.
Well,
Well, thanks, guys. I appreciate it.
that was awesome.
Thank you.
Very helpful and inspiring.
Yeah, I'm so stoked. I'm so even more stoked for Hegel. So even more. So that's my lazy language.
I feel relatively prepared to begin.
Relatively prepared to begin. Nice.
This is a good place to be.
I feel like I'm gonna get my ass kicked, but it'll be a good ass.
Oh yeah, no, it's gonna
Yeah.
happen.
Oh, you're in?
Sometimes it's fun to have this.
I've been wanting to read Hegel for a while. But
I haven't.
Yeah, that's kind of how it goes. You just hope you come out better on the other side, you know? That's the hope.
It doesn't kill
You'll either come out better or an analytic philosopher.
We're insane.
Or insane. Yeah. All right. Take care, y'all.
Bye, everybody.